Now, Eskom yesterday announced the appointment of Andre de Ruyter as its new CEO. De Ruyter, who's currently packaging company Nampak CEO, is set to take over the reins at the troubled power utility in January, making him the 10th Eskom CEO in 10 years. His appointment has been met with mixed reactions, with some saying that his track record at Nampak and not being an engineer may make it difficult for him to succeed at his new post. Now, one man who knows Eskom well, his former senior executive who spent nearly 3 decades at the power utility and is now an independent energy analyst, Dave Nicholls. Dave, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start with Andre de Ruyter. I mean, he's 10th in 10 years. That doesn't bode well for him going in. But some people are saying that he might be challenged not being an engineer and maybe not having industry knowledge.
Well, I think that the 10 in 10 years is more a function of the fact that they can't all be mistakes. And the real problem is if you put 10 in 10 years, it implies the policy they're trying to implement isn't working. So I suggest that one of the things you've got to think about very urgently is how do you align the state policy with a credible power industry?
All right, so if you were now the CEO, let's say I've appointed you,
heaven help.
And as someone who's been there 3 decades, you've seen it grow, you've seen it at its best and at its worst, what would you do? Let's start in the short term.
I think in the short term, the biggest issue Eskom's got now must be an internal morale issue. You've been through, as you say, 10 CEOs in 10 years. You've been accused of being all things evil. And I suspect that inside the company there's a very difficult morale situation. And to go with that is really a vision of where the company is going. So somehow he's got to come up with a vision which the staff in the company will buy into. It's all very well to say Eskom staff are all overpaid, lazy and should be dismissed. It doesn't do much for making power. And so to get the availability of the fleet up, he's got to be both aggressive in terms of control, but also he's got to be very much in terms of raising the morale of the organisation, getting the people to believe that it's valuable to be there.
All right, so we're hearing about splitting the entity into 3 parts, and I just wonder, from your perspective, what is the business model that needs to be looked at and how this entity should be run?
Well, I think first thing is I'm personally not a believer in the splitting into 3. I'm not sure what we gain by that. In splitting into 3 entities, you don't lose any of the debt. You don't lose any of the problems. In fact, you make more problems because you've got a whole pile of legal relationships between the different entities now, which previously was not legal. So things like sovereign guarantees for PPAs from the transmission group to the generation group will become a major cost issue for the Treasury. But the real thing is you've got to decide what is your view on how the industry should go. And I can put it in context. Historically, what utilities have done is they've ended up with the price being expressed in rand per kilowatt hour and averaged across both the time and the users to a large extent in a single group. But that's got no relationship to the costs of the company. We're sitting here now under lights that SABC is paying probably up to 2 rand a unit for buying electricity. And it's interesting to know that of that 2 rand, only 30 cents is the coal that's the marginal cost. The rest is the infrastructure to ensure that when you turn the light on, it comes on.
Right.
It's no point having more energy if you can't put it at the right time. So one thing Eskom must think about doing aggressively is looking at its tariffs. If we're going to go into a new regime where there are free market players of intermittent suppliers in the generation field, if people are putting PV on their roof such that they can then displace Eskom capacity, the value of that should be what we're referring to. So we should be looking at a much different structure where your fixed element of your connection is much higher. Now, whether this is actually a socially acceptable is a question, because if you look at something like RDP housing, probably of their charges, and I'll again say it's 2 rand, essentially only about 30 or 40 cents should actually be a variable cost.
Right.
So you should be turning around to Alex and saying, we're going to charge you 1,500 rand a month as a fixed charge, and then 40 cents a unit.
Okay.
And I don't think it would get much joy if we did that. I don't think it would much joy. So we've got to think through what these things are taking us towards. And if you take the view of if you're, and also the cost of energy changes over the day. People assume that energy is the same value all the time. Well, in California, for example, which has a lot of PV, their wholesale price of energy normally goes negative at midday. In other words, people are paid
to use energy.
It doesn't apply at the retail end, but essentially because there's so much PV, at midday, the demand is below the base capacity of the fleet.
So we should be thinking about over the day how much to be charging. Are we charging too much or too little for energy in South Africa?
On average, and I worked at a European Union study recently, we're actually in the lower end of the costs, both domestically and retail, in terms of you convert it to euros. We are cheaper than most industrial countries. The problem with our energy supply is not, for the industry, not so much the price, and I'm sure someone from EUIG will scream at me for saying this, but it's more the fact that if you're investing in a new industrial capacity, you want to be sure there will be energy for you when you get there, and it's built in 2 years' time. At the moment, we've been constraining our consumers since 2006. So the reason the economy has gone flatlined in many ways over the last 10 years has been because we haven't grown the demand.
All right. You know what? Sadly, we run out of time, but I don't know if you can very briefly tell me, what do you think broke Eskom and needs to be put back together?
Well, broke Eskom basically was the decision in the mid-late 90s that Eskom would no longer be the classical utility, but in fact would be constrained from building plant, which led to a situation of Eskom stop building plant. And so in 2007, Eskom had to constrain the customers, and we haven't recovered since then.
Okay, so that's where it all started.
It started. Everyone always blames the 9 wasted years for the energy crisis. My point is always the first load shedding was in 2007.
All right.
And unless the previous president was a genius, his policies couldn't induce load shedding 2 years before he took power.
All right, Dave, we've run out of time today, but I'm going to bring you back in because I think we need to further unpack this and just see how the new CEO needs to plot a course going forward. But thanks so much indeed for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.